Hi, I'm Dr. Chris Earle, a scientist from Scotland, and welcome to my platform MOL-BIO, which stands for the Meaning of Life and Molecular Biology. And here we will explore the big scientific and philosophical questions relating to all aspects of life, and we'll do this through my perspective as a molecular biologist. Today's video is about an article I recently posted, which is titled as follows: Is Richard Dawkins wrong about the nature of life? And is it time to abandon the metaphor of the selfish gene? It's posed as a question, but I believe the answer to these questions is yes. The selfish gene is not a good way to describe life. And 50 years have passed since the book was published, and I believe what we've learned from the world of molecular biology and others is that it's time to move to a more comprehensive framework for what life really is. But what I need to rule out first is what I am not saying. I am not challenging Richard Dawkins on the idea of the biological process of evolution. There is no doubt that organisms evolve over time by gradual changes and sometimes drastic changes. If you are interested in the science and philosophy of life, then please subscribe to this channel here. But also, if you look at the link tree in my bio, it will take you to all the different platforms that we are present on, particularly Medium and Substack, where you'll find the original article. Many of you will be familiar with Richard Dawkins through his vocal and sometimes controversial stance on atheism. However, those who have read his popular science books will know that he is kind of like the written word equivalent of David Attenborough's nature documentary narration. And what I mean by that is few people could claim to have inspired the level of deep appreciation at the beauty of the natural world as Richard Dawkins. And that's to say nothing about the recent comments that he's made on social media, which have become increasingly controversial. My argument here should not be misconstrued as an argument for intelligent design or creationism. I'm going to start with a personal reflection and what the selfish gene means to me. It was the first popular science book that I read in 2009, around 16 years ago, and that would have been the 30th anniversary edition of the book. It was in between leaving high school and going to university to study biology, and I cannot overemphasize the role that book played in inspiring me for many years to come. It was so exciting to see that someone was addressing the big, deep philosophical questions about the nature of life and doing so from a scientific perspective. To round off this personal reflection, after reading the book, I initially went to study biology. However, that became a molecular biology degree by the end, and this was still inspired by the type of work that Richard Dawkins had done. And that's because I was seeing that the most exciting discoveries into the nature of life were happening in the fields of molecular biology and in microbiology as well. So after my degree, I did a PhD in molecular microbiology, and I still work in microbiology research today. However, everything that I say on this platform and in this video is in my personal opinion and nothing to do with those other roles. So what is the selfish gene? And I'm going to read this from the article. In short, the selfish gene is that humans and all living organisms are survival machines constructed by DNA for the benefit of DNA. The mortal body is transient and temporary, but the gene may be passed on to the next generation. In this way, genes are considered immortal or potentially immortal, outliving the organism and surpassing it in terms of importance. Information is king, specifically inherited information in the form of the gene. Richard Dawkins does not think that genes are conscious entities that can display the quality of selfishness. He has even said that the book could have instead been called the immortal gene or the altruistic organism or something like that. And that's because, and again, it's not saying that all life is inherently selfish. A lot of this book is about altruistic and cooperative behaviours. It's just that he thinks they can be explained by the sort of self-interested nature of genes, and self-interested purely in the sense of natural selection favouring genes that increase their own chances of being propagated into the future. The selfish gene had emerged from the world of evolutionary biology, where there was a long-standing debate between people who thought that natural selection, which is the way that evolution is known to change organisms over time because of their differential survival and reproduction. Some people thought that natural selection may be acting on groups of organisms. Some people think it's at the level of organisms. And there was an increasing number of evolutionary biologists, including Richard Dawkins, but many others too, that believe that the natural selection was acting at the level of the gene. So this is the gene's eye view of how organisms change over time. And it's quite compelling because if you look over evolutionary time, and even quite short time scales if you're a microbiologist like me, you will see DNA change. And this whole gene's eye view was also informed by population genetics. As you watched populations change over time, the frequencies of certain genes would increase and others would decrease. And in a way, you could sort of think of evolution as being the competition between genes at the level of genes. Now, there has been a number of comprehensive challenges to the selfish gene, in particular from the world of evolutionary biology, where people have said that this is an incomplete picture. But I'm not going to rehash those arguments here, although I probably will get into all of that at some point in the future. I want to present a different type of argument against the selfish gene here, informed by some of that work. And I'm going to put a number of these resources with descriptions in the video description below that you can follow and look up for yourself. So I'll find some open access papers where you don't need to pay, they're not behind a paywall. The argument that I'm making is one to do with scientific reductionism. So reductionism is the approach to look at the fundamental constituents of a system, a complex system like a living organism. And actually the most useful way to think about organisms in this case is maybe think of a single-celled eukaryotic organism or a bacterial cell. So if we look at a single cell and we look inside at the level, at the subcellular level of atoms and molecules, of course we're going to come to the very, very interesting molecule of DNA. And DNA is a repository of information, and we shouldn't overlook just how incredible that is. So the idea of the selfish gene is to think of the information in the DNA in the form of the gene, which is a difficult thing to define, and the more we learn about how DNA works and genes work, it's become increasingly difficult to define. So I'm not going to get into that argument just now. I don't actually think we need to in order to challenge the selfish gene framework. Richard Dawkins devotes a fair bit of time to the idea of the RNA world. And this is about the origins of life. And at the time, the RNA world was by far the dominant perspective. And the reason for that is crucial. And that is because we didn't talk about the origins of life being a DNA world. DNA was arguably a little bit too complex to have been the starting point, but more importantly, it doesn't have the capabilities that RNA has. It can't really do anything. Whereas RNA is a very similar molecule to DNA. It can contain information, but it can also do stuff. It can be a catalyst. It can make things happen. It could possibly even control its own replication. So RNA could be thought of as the original replicator or self-replicator. And in this way, it's thought that the replicator is the original thing. The purpose of life is the molecule wants to replicate itself. And so those are the properties that Dawkins imbues onto DNA. These are ORP genes, and these are replicators. But I don't think that the way that Richard Dawkins uses the term replicators is quite appropriate. If we're going to be reductionists and look at the molecular level, and we're going to describe what happens at the molecular level, and we're going to think about what are the molecules that do things, which build things, which make things happen, then RNA to some extent, but more importantly, proteins. Proteins are much more chemically diverse than DNA. They're the builders. They're the ones that process energy. They are the constructors that build the cell. And importantly, they're also the ones responsible for replicating DNA. You see, DNA is not a self-replicator in the sense that Richard Dawkins describes it in the book. DNA depends upon an army of proteins for it to be replicated. And that army of proteins not only replicates the DNA, but also ensures that when errors occur in the DNA, that it's fixed. So you see, DNA is entirely dependent upon proteins. And importantly, proteins are also dependent upon DNA for their existence, because the information which tells the cell which protein to make is written in the DNA. They are mutually interdependent. You can't have one without the other. And Richard Dawkins does set up a bit of a false dichotomy in the way he describes almost like the replicator being that really important thing, and the survival machine being of, let's say, lesser importance. I believe that the genetic information and the cell and the subcellular components, the proteins, the RNA that can make things happen, process energy and build the cell and the organism are of at least equal importance. And it takes an enormous amount of energy to build biological systems and cells and organisms. And not only that, it takes an enormous amount of energy to build DNA. And DNA cannot funnel that energy for its own construction. So life is incredibly dependent on energetics. And actually in Erwin Schrödinger, he's a famous quantum physicist, he turned his focus on to the nature of life in probably beginning in the 1930s, but certainly in the 1940s when he delivered a series of lectures which became a book called What is Life? It was before they knew how DNA was the inherited material in the structure of DNA. So there was a lot of speculation about what the inherited material might take the form of. So half the book's kind of devoted to that, but the other half is about energy. It's about how the laws of physics, in particular, the laws of thermodynamics, how they are compatible with life. At the time, it was thought that life sort of contravenes the laws of physics. Things should become more disordered over time. And that's due to the laws of the second law of thermodynamics, which shows that things kind of descend toward disorder. If they start off ordered, they become disordered over time. And I use that word cautiously because it's not quite the correct definition of entropy, but we'll do much more discussion on thermodynamics in the future. The crucial thing here is that life doesn't contravene the second law of thermodynamics. The reason life can maintain complexity and order is because it's continually consuming energy. It's not, you see, the second law of thermodynamics was based upon Victorian ideas about engines and those were closed systems. True and appropriate scientific reductionism, thinking about life on the molecular level, would appreciate this role of energy, the capacity of proteins to funnel energy, to build things, to replicate DNA, to fix errors. All of that takes energy. Now, because Richard Dawkins basically overlooked that fact in The Selfish Gene, he has basically oversimplified things and inadvertently conveyed a lot of those properties onto the DNA. to say that DNA is the thing that constructs the organism or builds the organism or is the reason for the organism. Yes, the information is crucial as a way to develop complexity as a repository. You can get more and more complex proteins being made because it's encoded in DNA, and that's crucial. But it doesn't say anything about the energy required to build an organism. The way that some of the other critiques of the selfish gene have talked about this is they don't like the way that the metaphors, some of the language that Richard Dawkins uses seems to suggest this sort of agency of DNA, its capacity as a causal influence. And this is the argument that Denis Noble, and he had a great debate with Richard Dawkins a few years ago, which is on YouTube, and I'll link that in the video description below. And that's kind of his argument that the metaphor wrongly imbues DNA with a causal properties. But as I said, DNA is not the thing that causes things to happen. So why did Richard Dawkins see it that way then? Well, because he was coming at it from this evolutionary perspective, they were looking at something called kin selection, which was a growing field at the time. And it showed that the behavior of certain animals could be explained, particularly the cooperative behaviors, the altruistic behaviors, could be explained by their genetic relatedness. The closer the genetic relatedness, the more cooperative the behaviors between two individuals of the same species. And the explanation ultimately for that, and there's a lot more to it than this, but the ultimate explanation for that is that genes construct the organisms. Genes are the things that are inherited. And so genes are that benefit their own propagation by making the organism do things that are beneficial for its reproduction, will proliferate in a population. And a population geneticist will see those gene versions, those versions of those genes, those alleles, will see them increase in number in the population. So what Richard Dawkins has done is he's looked at life on a very high level so you can think of life being organized at the level of molecules and atoms, then cells, then multicellular conglomerations in certain microbial species. In complex organisms, you go up another level, you've got tissues, organs, and then we'll jump up to the whole organism, and then how those organisms are organized into groups and, in extreme cases, societies as well. So Richard Dawkins is way up at this higher order level and finding an explanation down here at the fundamental molecular level. And it's just that in order to do so, to marry those two observations at those different levels, has required overlooking far too much information. If we look at Denis Noble, and his most comprehensive book here is called Dance to the Tune of Life. Now he's a systems biologist, and there's a little bit of a disagreement between the systems biologists who may discuss things like emergent properties and maybe even challenge the capacity for a reductionist approach and the limits by which it can explain those higher level phenomenon. Whereas if you were to look at someone from a physics background like Liam Graham, who's written this incredible book, Molecular Storms, which describes that subcellular environment that I'm talking about of molecules, DNA, proteins, energy, thermodynamics. They might say that, well, a reductionist approach, like a true physicalist approach describing the laws of nature, we could explain the higher level biological phenomenon and other phenomenon in the universe entirely. And our inability to do so is purely a limit of our current level of knowledge. So there's a big debate there about whether reductionism can be an all-powerful tool to understand reality, or whether we need to invoke different descriptions entirely to describe the higher level phenomenon. But I'm not going to try and resolve that debate here, and we will look into that in a future article and episode, which I'm really looking forward to covering. But what you can't do is use a form of reduction, a form of reductionism, which focuses on only one of the crucial biological molecules in the form of DNA to the except, by overlooking the other ones. That's a narrow and inappropriate application of reductionism. So you could argue whether reductionism is as powerful as people say it is and what the limits are and if there are limits. But we're not doing that. We're saying that reductionism can be a powerful tool, but you cannot do a form of reductionism where you just focus on one component of that reductionist environment, the subcellular environment. And I should be clear that not every scientist agrees that there's a problem with the gene's eye view of evolution and that there's a problem with the selfish gene framework. And you will hear different opinions. However, I think that the knowledge and insights accumulated over the 50 years since the book was published have transformed our understanding of life. And as a molecular biologist and with this platform, that's what I'm going to explore. Some of the feedback that I've had, which I'd like to respond to here. For example, some people say, well, this book was written 50 years ago. What's the big deal? Well, actually, some would argue that it's had a profound inhibitory impact in terms of our understanding of medicine because we've overemphasized the role of genome. And the human genome that was sequenced in the early 2000s was supposed to bring in this new age of medicine and cure so many diseases. However, that's not turned out to be the case because genomics is only part of the picture, and some of the other aspects of the picture is what I'm talking about. Furthermore, even though the book is 50 years old, Richard Dawkins has said many times that he basically stands by it. And he, as I said, you can look at that debate between him and Denis Noble, the video description below. So he stands by it, and he's not in those subsequent editions, such as this one here, the 40th anniversary edition. And there will, as far as I know, I think there will be a 50th anniversary edition next summer. And up until now, he's added some discussion into the forewords of the book, but he hasn't changed the text. I personally think he needs to change the text, the selfish gene, and make some concessions and really pull in and draw away from the level of bombast that was in the original book. Another thing is the language of which we used to use to think of DNA as being the blueprint for life. The DNA was the entirety of the information needed to create a living thing, but it's not. You also need the cell, and the cell contains the components that read the DNA. So, as you know, in your body, there's lots and lots of different cell types, but for the most part, they contain the same DNA. So what determines why a liver cell or a heart cell or a skin cell or a neuron forms? And that's because it's how the DNA is read, which is determined by the environmental context and the cellular context. So a lot of the challenge to the idea that the selfish gene also comes from the world of evolutionary developmental biology and embryology. There's a lot to be said about the metaphors we use in science. For example, the idea that DNA is a blueprint, which is not ideal because DNA alone is never going to be enough. The totality of the information in the DNA is never going to be enough to build an organism. You're also going to need that DNA to at least be inside of a cell, which has other forms of biological molecules and information within it. Also, you might have heard people describe life as being a machine. Somewhat useful as a tool to describe certain things, and some things are more machine-like than others, but life is very different from a machine, in particular its capacity to make replicates of itself, to rebuild itself, to renew and to regenerate, and to have these multiple generations. And this was something that was noticed a long time ago by the mathematical scientist John von Neumann in his idea of von Neumann machines, which were machines that could replicate themselves, something we've not been able to do yet. So maybe if we can start to build machines like that, then they may be an even more appropriate metaphor for what life is. Thank you for listening to this video. As I said, if you follow the link in my bio, you can find the articles on Medium and Substack to read in more detail. And there's a great discussion, particularly on the platform Medium, if you have access to that. Importantly though, I think that we'll only truly appreciate the limitations of the metaphor of the selfish gene when we start to explore all of these other facets of life that are missing from that account, published originally in 1976. So as we go on in this platform, we're going to talk about thermodynamics. We're going to talk about the new science of thermodynamics. It's understanding how it may be even somewhat of a creative force in the process of life or not. So we'll explore all of that and more in future episodes from MOL-BIO. Thank you.